Hey, what's going on guys? My name is Rampage and welcome to Gaming News. Now, I am still sick, so bear with me, but this article is Alien Isolation PC requirements puts minimum RAM at 4 gigabytes. Now, just before I get into the PC specs, I just want to clarify that 4 gigs and 8 gigs of system RAM, when you're talking about minimum and recommended specs, when they list this kind of shit, doesn't mean the game will use 4 gigs of system RAM. It means that you need a system that has 4 gigabytes or above in order for the game to fucking function. I just want to make that clear just before I get into this, because a lot of people on the forums everywhere that you talk about new games and stuff, where they state 4 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes of RAM just to get the game to function, is not how you should be looking at it, because most cases the game will not be using above 2 gigabytes of system RAM. Now, there are some cases where they may use 500 megs above 2 gigabytes, but most of the time they don't. Now, I'll explain that in a second. Now, minimum specs is OS, Windows 7 32-bit, processor 3.16 GHz, Intel Core 2 Duo E8500, memory 4 gigabytes of RAM, graphics card 1 gigabyte, AMD Radeon HD 5550 or NVIDIA GeForce GT 430, DirectX 11 with 35 gigabytes of hard drive space. Recommended OS, Windows 7 64-bit, processor AMD Phenom 2 X4 955, 4-core 3.2 GHz or Intel Core 2 Quad Q 960, whatever that means, 4-core 3.0 GHz. Some of these numbers I just don't really know how to say fluently. Memory 8 gigs of system RAM, graphics card 2 gigs, AMD Radeon R9 200 series or NVIDIA GeForce GTX 660, DirectX 11, 35 gigabytes of hard drive space. So you could assume if you have a better GPU and a better processor than this, you should be, in theory, able to play the game correctly. Now, one thing that I've hated with PC recommended specs or PC requirements is that they don't give a baseline frame rate for both minimum and recommended. Because in most cases, you'll find that the recommended specs, which is supposed to be better, is still low end. This is still low end. 660, still low end. A Phenom 2 X4 955 is a low-end CPU. It's not low-end, but it's low-end in comparison to what's out now. In comparison, so is mine, but, But, yeah, I just want to say my specs. My specs are an Intel Core i5 2500K, clocked at 4.5 GHz, 16 gigs of Kingston HyperX 1600 MHz, RAM overclocked to 1866, a Asus GTX 770 OC edition, 2 gigs of VRAM overclocked to, I think, plus 80 on the core, plus 95 on the memory. So it's fairly overclocked. And most of the time in the last 9 months, most of the games have equivalent PC specs to this, or say like a 760, perform like complete shit. Now, this is where I want to get into the fact that recommended isn't indeed recommended. For most games, anyway. Because recommended would imply that the frame rate would be around a playable 60 frames per second. That's how I look at it, right? That's just what I expect. I expect minimum to be a minimum of 30 frames per second and a reasonable frame drop, right? Recommended should be targeting 60 frames per second. I don't give a shit what game it is. That's how it should work. You're giving 2 spec lists. You're giving minimum and recommended. But yet you're not giving a frame rate. You're not giving an average frame rate for those 2 systems, right? So in order to actually make sense of this, you have to give a frame rate, because if you don't give a frame rate and the game performs like shit, if you have higher specs than the recommended specs, yet the game is running at, say, 35 to 45 frames per second maxed out with 2 times AA or FXAA, then, you know, you're going to be pissed, and you're going to be a pissed off customer. I.e., this has happened to me in the past with several fucking games. Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which, you know, for some reason when you turned on VSync, it would lock to 30. That game, I think, had an unlocked frame rate of 63 frames per second. Wolfenstein and New Water was another good example where the game's recommended specs were kind of low end, but yet the game still ran like shit when you turned it up. But yet you couldn't fix it because most of the console commands that you used for Rage were, you know, were removed by the developer, or they just didn't work. So, in order to actually make sense of recommended and minimum specs, especially when it comes to memory, because a lot of people look at this, especially this fucking article guy who made this article, Rob Crossley, pointed out that 4 gigs of memory is required. Well, 4 gigs of memory is required in order to run a system that's actually functional. When I look at this, I go, okay, memory of 4 gigabytes for minimum. If I have a system around those specs, then, you know, that should be fine. I should be able to run the game, but it won't be at a reasonably playable frame rate. 8 gigs of total system RAM means that I have, you know, RAM spare that I can use later on, or, you know, just so my system won't cramp itself up. When article writers don't breach, or when they breach the lines between whether your system actually needs this, or whether, you know, the game will need 4 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes of system RAM, you're kidding yourself. Games now barely used over 2 gigabytes of system RAM, and I'll explain why. Most games go by VRAM usage. If your VRAM is using around 2 gigabytes, you have a 2 gig card, the game will be using around 2 gigabytes of system RAM, or slightly under 2 gigabytes of system RAM. Say if you have a 4 gigabyte card and you're using about 3 gigabytes, and the game runs at 64-bit OS, sometimes the game will go above 2 gigabytes of system RAM. Some games do still go above 2 gigabytes of system RAM. I'm not gonna push that, but most of the time it will be under 2 gigabytes. But anyway, guys, what do you think about this? Do you think that PC specs should be more clear? They should have a targeted frame rate, or targeted average frame rate, or minimum, maximum, and average frame rate? I believe that's how it should be, because if I'm looking at this and I go, okay, my system should be able to run this, and I buy the game, yet I can't run it at around 60 frames per second, what's the point on having a recommended spec list if the specs that are recommended for a decent frame rate are well above those specs? What's the point? Right? Why is recommended even there? What is the targeted frame rate, and what is recommended towards the developer? But anyway, guys, my name is Rampage. Please don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. I will read all your feedback if you give me feedback, or just sort of give me your thoughts on what's going on here in the comment section below. But my name is Rampage. Please don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.